Okay, thanks for coming. I want to welcome you all to the Texas Politics Speaker Series. We are thrilled today to have a post-election review of the sharpest minds covering Texas politics today. Immediately to my left, Ross Ramsey of Texas Weekly. Next to him is Karen Brooks of the Dallas Morning News. And next to her, Harvey Kronberg of Harvey Kronberg's Quorum Report. And I really, without doing too much in the way of extensive introduction, which I think will come around as we talk, I really just want to get started. And the first thing I really want to start talking about is, kind of first cut. We know who won at the top level. We know the House is very close. We know there were Democratic gains in the legislature. But in your view, kind of what's the underlying story of the election? Why don't we actually start with Harvey and then move this way?
The primary underlying story is that the Democrats are showing signs of actually being an organized party. You look at every statewide office virtually, and the Republicans won. They gained a seat in Congress, but at the end of the day, it was a better day for Democrats. The margins by which Republicans won have shrunk over the course of the decade, and you're seeing signs of organization. Every urban county except Tarrant went Democratic. And Tarrant County elected a Democratic senator. So compared to a decade ago when the Democratic Party was essentially on life support, there's enough success right now to draw good candidates and good money and reasonable amounts of fundraising going forward. And so while I won't go so far quite yet as to say we're a two-party state, we're sure showing we're moving in that direction a lot faster than most of us thought would be the case.
I also think the second part of that story would be taking a look at how much of that was the Obama effect in the 50-state strategy and how far that's going to carry the Texas Democrats. On their own, they couldn't swing it too well in the last few years, but this time around, they made huge gains or strides as far as Democrats in Texas can go. Now, in 2 years, it'll be interesting to see if they can carry that on their own without an Obama at the top of the ticket. Now they're going to have lots of other motivations to take over, say, the House in 2010. But it'll be interesting for me, and I think for a lot of us, to see how much they can carry on this momentum on their own without someone from the top pulling them along.
The Democrats this time were financially competitive for the first time in a number of cycles, and because they were financially competitive, particularly in House races, they were able to exploit a Republican mistake. When the Republicans drew the redistricting maps, they drew a congressional map that has pretty much held its ground. They drew a map for the Texas Senate that has pretty much held its numbers, but they sliced the districts too thin in the House. They wanted to get more seats, and they said, for example, in Travis County we can get 2 Republican seats. Why don't we push it a little bit and try for 3? And the result is that 3 cycles later, they have no seats. So the Democrats, because they were financially in the game this time and did a good job of recruiting candidates, were able to pick at those Republican maps. And I think if the Republicans hadn't made that redistricting mistake, we would be sitting here saying, the Republicans have all 29 statewide positions, which they do. They have the Congress, they have the Senate, and they still have the House. But because of that map, the Democrats are, the House has been pushed into parity.
Those are such institutional factors. I'm wondering, you all travel around the state a lot. You all look at polling a lot. Do you think there's change going on underneath in Texas at all, or is this all is it the same folks feeling the same way, looking at different arrays of candidates or looking at the same candidates? Is there political change in Texas?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the ballot for the last several cycles has been red at the top and blue at the bottom. Where people would elect, they would vote for Bush, but you got down to the sheriff's race and they'd vote for a Democrat. Or you got down to the judges' races and they'd vote for a Democrat. The big crack in this was in 2006. Dallas County went Democratic. The courthouse flipped. They got a Democratic county judge, a Democratic sheriff, but the line sort of stopped at the legislative races. Now, because of these House races, that little blue line is creeping up a little bit and it's getting more purple, but it's still red at the top. So I think it's changing, and as Harvey pointed out, in the urban counties, Harris County, Travis County, Bexar County, Dallas County, El Paso County, all voted for the loser in the presidential race. Something's out of balance there.
Well, let me ask you guys a question following up on that actually Ross asked me, I think, kind of rhetorically on the phone last week, and that is, what does that mean when the urban counties are voting one way, in many ways, in a very pronounced way, and the rest of Texas is voting the other way?
I don't think it's any big surprise that rural Texas is still solidly Republican with a few exceptions out there. The battleground, if the cities are voting overwhelmingly Democratic and the rural areas are voting overwhelmingly Republican. The battleground is where it always was, which is in the suburbs, where there is Democratic success, increasing Democratic success, particularly where the suburban county abuts to the city. So southern Williamson County elected a Democrat, amazingly enough. Irving, Texas elected a Democrat, which abuts obviously to Fort Worth and between Fort Worth and Dallas. So the battleground has gone to the suburbs, and the suburbs are far less homogeneous than they were 5 or 8 years ago.
Yeah, building on that suburban, one of the things that we saw in this election that it has been the turning blue of Arlington, Texas, and this incredibly tight race just north of, well, I guess northwest of Dallas and Irving. And you know, Linda Harper Brown is a great example of what's going on out there. Now we've seen the demographics in her district changing. Irving used to be considered to be just a kind of a bedroom community and suburb, and it's growing. It's got a large minority population. And she is a Republican House member who, at the moment, is hanging on to her seat by 20 votes in a, I don't know how many were cast in that election, 40,000. So you've got, and by the way, the Democratic candidate, Bob Romano, didn't get any money from the state Democrats, who are now kind of kicking themselves for that. You know, $1,500 might have pushed him over the edge, you know. But, you know, and that was kind of a sleeper. Nobody really even saw that coming. And those of us who were hearing the buzz right before it were going, really? Linda Harper Brown? I mean, I don't see her losing that race. And I think Bob Romano was as surprised as anybody. You know, he was saying, I think he told one of our reporters up there, you know, yeah, I guess there is a lot of pressure on me. You know, I just want to get out of here and go deer hunting. That was his quote to us in the paper. I think it caught everybody off guard.
It is a representative democracy.
Yes.
Right. If he put that on TV, he might have won.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
So you saw that, and you saw the toppling of a very conservative House member, I mean, in Arlington. And you even saw a Democrat take a special election in Southwest Fort Worth, which was a Republican district for a long time. Now he didn't hold on to it in the general, but it's been an interesting. In the suburbs, there's a demographic that's changing, that's turning blue, that's really changing the face of a lot of these elections, I think.
I wanted to follow up on something that you said. Is there something really changing out there? And I think there is. Slower than it is happening in the rest of the country, but the Republican coalition that's existed since Ronald Reagan, those pieces are fraying apart with increasing speed. The fastest growing group of voters out there is Latino. They've essentially, at least for the time being, abandoned the Republican Party. You have higher participation from African Americans. You go to the state Republican convention, there's no young people there. The state Democratic convention is full of young people. Obviously, you can't have a party with a future without young people. Nationally, if you're college educated and making $150,000 or more a year, you've left the Republican Party. If you're a moderate, you've left the Republican Party. And that's happening to a lesser degree here, but it is the same dynamic that is happening nationally.
You guys agree with that?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, one of the things that keeps showing up in the polls nationally that also shows up in the polling in Texas, some of the stuff that you've done and that others have done, is that about the same number of people identify themselves as conservatives and as liberals when you ask them, what's your political view? But the number of people who identify themselves as Democrats and Republicans is changing pretty quickly. And they're not necessarily growing the Democrats, it's growing a little bit, but they're coming off the Republican label and saying, well, really I'm a moderate, or really I'm an independent. And this mirrors what happened in the early and mid 80s in Texas when the Democrats, had control of everything. 1982, the Democrats swept all of those offices that I listed a minute ago, and had control of the state government, and it started to chip away. And the same thing happened. People identified themselves in about the same numbers as liberals or conservatives, but started drifting away from the Democratic label. And right now, they're drifting away from the Republican label. Where it lands, I mean, there's no way to know. It's sort of one of those things you can see in a rearview mirror, but not out the windshield. Well, so we'll know it when we pass it.
Well, and I think their sense of where home is still, I mean, reflexively, polling in that Noriega-Cornyn race, we got 14% undecided going into the end of that. A lot of those people wind up going home. It turned out we were pretty close to right on that, despite the irate phone calls.
When a campaign call, you wouldn't be irate.
Well, so let's talk about that. I mean, in a different way. Then, I mean, I guess one would to parse that out or to kind of break it down a little bit more is to say, so what is it going to take for that to change? I mean, is it really going to, to push it? I mean, is Texas going to catch up, or is Texas going to be kind of the stronghold of the permanent Republican minority, or the next Republican minority while they rebuild? I mean, to me, that's a fascinating question.
I think they're having an internal conversation nationally, and right now, as David Brooks refers to them, the traditionalist conservatives are winning the argument, at least on the get-go, which is we need to purify the party, that we actually haven't been conservative enough. We've abandoned conservative principles, but it doesn't jive with any polling that I've seen that Barack Obama had 44% of his vote was self-identified moderates that haven't got any place else to land. And it's not that the Democrats offered any great agenda necessarily. They just weren't Republicans. We're at the end of the Republican storyline, and they haven't come up with a new rhetoric yet.
Will Texas remain the stronghold of the permanent Republican minority? Having come to Texas 10 years ago, I kind of find it hard to believe that they were ever a stronghold of the Democratic, party. It seems to me like as we're in the buckle of the Bible Belt, and you've got two very different types of Republicans having a real big battle in Texas, and one of them you see as being the traditional Christian, which there's no the Christian evangelical type of Republican, and there's no shortage of them in Texas. And then on the other side of the coin, you've got what I like to call the Houston Republicans, who are there's a big group of them over there, who are very anti-tax, anti-constitution. They're pro-constitutional cap on spending. They're very fiscally conservative, and so it seems to me like they're gaining a lot more ground, in popularity or maybe in politically than the evangelicals. And I don't know where that's going to land, but I am seeing that there's that play now between them. Now whether that equates into strength at the end of the day of the Republican Party in Texas is on a national stage, to me, it's hard to answer that question. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see them ceding any power to the Democrats on that front. I don't know if that made any sense. I'm kind of thinking out loud on this, but it's an interesting idea, when you think about that the Republicans in Texas don't know who they are, then they can't be really in that big a shape, great a shape nationally either.
Well, and it was sort of an interesting election. I mean, like they said, they won all these statewide races. They won Congress, they won the Senate, they won the House narrowly, but they won it. They're in control, they're winning, right? And they were really depressed the next day. So what's going on with that? And I think what's going on is that it really surprised a lot of Republicans I know that the Democrats were as competitive as they were financially in these really tight races. You would go to a House race, say the Klein-Schmidt-Dipple race over in Bastrop, or the Maldonado-Daniel race just north of Austin, races around the state like that. And it's not unusual at the end of a race in Texas in the last couple of cycles for the Republican candidate to suddenly go from a $70,000 campaign to a $470,000 campaign. But what happened this time was that happened at the same time the Democratic campaign was doing the same thing. A couple of these were $2 million House races, which is sort of incredible in its own right. But the Democrats were competitive that way. Now, what happened with the Republicans last time, and sort of in the late '80s and into the '90 election and the '92 election, was that they were financially competitive, and they finally got candidates who were willing to run. And the '90 election, when they finally busted into the statewide ticket, Kay Hutchison ran. She hadn't been in state office for, somebody's going to have to check me on this, for 15 or 16 years at that point. She'd been working at Republic Bank in Dallas, done some stuff in the private sector. There was no way she was going to win the treasurer's race, but she said, "Yeah, I'll put my name on there. I'll do what we need." And then they got a backbencher from the Texas House who had just changed parties, Rick Perry, to run against Jim Hightower. Jim Hightower, at that time, Jim Hightower and Phil Gramm were the top polling Texans. I mean, they were the most popular candidates in Texas. It was an impossible race. But somehow they cracked through. And it did two things. The people that take that risk, as we can see now, are the ones who lead the party, right? Yeah. So, if you don't get shot, the pioneer's the guy with the arrow in his back. But if somehow the arrows miss you, and you run out front, you get to be the governor, you get to be the senior senator.
The founder.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're the first people. But it also creates the sort of the institutional foothold for the rest of the party to come in '92 and in '90 and especially in '94. And the Democrats, to take that a step further, they've got the financial competitiveness now. They're not running candidates. I mean, the statewide ticket, they ran the Dream Team ticket, which was a pretty good ticket a couple of years ago, but they didn't follow it with a strong ticket. You have to keep plugging at a strong ticket. You can't. You're not going to win those elections with candidates like Fred Head, right, who really aren't. They're holding the place, but they're really not competitive, and they're really not, present in the campaigns.
Yeah, it seemed like an odd campaign to use "Blast from the Past" in 2006.
Yeah.
It's odd.
Yeah. Well, it's obviously not lost on anybody in this room, but the next election is all going to be about redistricting. And I think the White House probably has some interest in what happens in Texas redistricting. So I suspect that resources will be available. Success breeds success, and I think we'll see a much better slate of candidates. The only candidates that Democrats really, it's obviously need a strong guy at the top of the ticket or gal doing the governor's race, but the comptroller, the attorney general, and the land commissioner are the ones that sit on the legislative redistricting board. So I don't think they're going to have any shortage of talent or resources or support. Or the Justice Department's going to be looking over the shoulder. Voter suppression is going to be more difficult. There's a lot of institutional advantages that Democrats haven't had for at least a decade. That at least get them to parity. Not that they're going to be successful, but it's a different landscape that they're looking at. And the Los Angeles Times on Sunday ran a story that we posted in our clips that said Texas is next. At least for this election cycle, they broke the Republican hegemony in the South, and there's obviously pockets now of blue in population centers all over Texas, and I think that it will be a national target for Democrats this next summer.
It's going to take real leadership to do that. And I mean, that LA Times piece was interesting because I went and pulled that up. And the Texas is in the headline, but Texas really only gets mentioned a few times. And it seems like that happens a lot with talking about, emphasizing Texas. Sometimes it's just, it seems to me, as often as not, it's a feint. And then at the end of the day, what happens? You wind up, in this campaign, and it was a rational move. Texas still, they extracted cash and campaign labor out of Texas, and it was a net loss. Now, the terrain is different next time around, but I think, there's a certain amount of waiting for Godot that goes on with, the Texas Democrats waiting for the national party to come save them.
Oh, I'm just saying there's going to be things available. The party's not going to save us. It has to happen from the ground up. But there is going to be resource that has not been available for, 20, 30 years. Not the least of which is a Democratic Justice Department.
I want to move on to analysis and/or especially gossip about the speaker's race, but I want to ask one more question before we move on to the juicy stuff, and that is, the Obama presidency looms large in these discussions. It kept kind of coming up. Directly, what is the experience of the Obama presidency going to be like in Texas, given all the flux here? And the reason I ask that, I mean. Ross and I think probably some people in this room, I know for sure, were at an event at UT last week where we saw little glimpses of how the Republicans were going to confront that and were struggling to confront that. Now, granted, it was, 2 days after the election, but, we saw one statewide official wander around in the weeds a little bit, but not be particularly hostile about Obama. And then we saw another statewide official wander around in the weeds a lot and be directly hostile about Obama. And so, would you kids behave? Oh, that's right. We invited you to not behave. And finally, it's finally starting. No, so what's that going to be like? I mean, what's it going to be like? And this is not so much a strategy. It's kind of a political culture question.
What I've been hearing from my most reliable polling source, which is all my friends on Facebook. Actually, the reaction I've been hearing a lot is that people are afraid that they're going to lose their guns. It's a big issue. There is a
Which part of Facebook is this?
I'm not kidding.
I'm glad I'm not your friend on Facebook.
Also on there's a bill filed yesterday that would affirm the right of Texans to hunt and fish. And I don't know what behind the fishing part, but I can tell you the hunting part. I'm not kidding. If you cast it hard enough, it can be a weapon, Ross. Okay. I don't. Obviously, that's not going to be the only concern, but resounding it's resounding comments, have been to me that I've been hearing have been not only that you better be prepared for them to take away your guns, but people are also buying out guns at gun shows. There was a big one up in Fort Worth maybe this weekend where the second day it was almost empty. Like people just bought up all these, weapons and all these, thinking that they're not going to be able to do it in a year. It's that's just the regular people. I'm not talking about the politicians, although they're going to be voicing that too. But that's the first thing I started hearing.
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ross.
No, I'm still stuck in Facebook. Go right ahead.
Well, obviously the rest of the country's in recession. Texas, for all practical purposes, went into recession or is on the edge of recession. We're going to follow the rest of the country. So the timing of when we go into the recession and when we come out of it is going to inform a lot of how the political culture of how we feel about Barack Obama. And whatever he does, it's going to be, or whatever the Democratic Congress does, it's going to be painful on the front end. There's going to be a lot of economic stress. There's going to be a lot of unemployment. When bad things happen in the economy, resentment tends to escalate. And so I think we're going to see, a serious amount of resentment. The question is whether Reagan made the same gamble, although slightly different ethnicity and race, but he made the same gamble at the beginning of his campaign, or the beginning of his presidency, and it pulled out quickly, relatively quickly. It took a couple of years. If we've got a stable economy and we're growing again, and all those resentments that happen in a downward spiral, they will dissipate if we have a good economy, or at least our 101Ks are back to at least 201Ks, down from 401Ks. So I think that it's external events beyond what the specifics of Barack Obama are that will define how we relate in the culture.
Yeah, there's kind of two lines here. One of them is the political line, and I think the political people are kind of looking at this campaign and this election and going, what exactly did he do? How did he pull that off? And what can we, seriously, part of this was social networking, part of this was this massive email list, part of this was this unbelievable fundraising organization. Yeah. And so you've got all of these things that people are still figuring out, and then you've got sort of the second level of that is, when people in politics or people in lobbying are trying to figure those things out, to figuring out how to exploit them. How can I use that? What do I add to my toolbox here? Yeah. So how can I raise money that quickly, and how can I mobilize people that quickly, and can I get a mob to form on the Capitol grounds if I don't like a bill, and how much lead time do I need? It used to take 3 days and a bunch of school buses to do that. Now I can do it with a really good email list. So there's all of that kind of stuff going on. And then on the other line is, how does Obama use this mechanism that he's got set up to reinforce his position? The thing with Ronald Reagan that was sort of notable at the time was his ability to talk past Congress and to save on electricity, right? That's right. It's a rolling blackout to kind of talk past Congress directly to the American people. And Congress, at the time was really worried about this, and holy cow, they're stepping over us. This is a whole new way to do that. And one of the tricks about this one is that you don't even, if you've got at least with Reagan, you had a TV set and you could monitor what the other side was doing if you were a Democrat, right? He's on TV again. We got to figure out what to do. Now they look at it, and the problem for his opponents is going to be they don't necessarily know when he's mobilizing, right? And he's got this email list. They hit that button that said, a few months ago, send money to the Obama campaign, help us, help us, help us. Now says, we need your backing on this bill. Call your congressman, write your congressman, do this kind of thing. And there really is a mob on the, So I think just in terms of
if they use those tools that way,
the technology and the mechanisms of politics, I think they've got some really interesting stuff, and that could change how we do things even down here at the state capitol. If they figure it out at the federal level, all the things that work get stolen.
Right. Yeah, it's an unprecedented immediate strategy and use of tools. Honestly, I think when I think about this, what I was really thinking was something a little more visceral, which is, I knew a handful of people and many people that called and said, what, I feel really engaged. Actually the phrase I heard over and over again is, I feel proud of the country for the first time in a really long time. Mm-hmm. And then the other people that I've heard that say, what, this scares me.
Yeah.
Right.
We brought a life coach onto the Dallas Morning News. Eli Davidson was her name, and she Incidentally, played Alex P. Keaton's girlfriend on Family Ties back in the day, but I couldn't find a picture of that to put up there. But she was a life coach that we got to do a live chat. I know, the character's fine. And we had like 60 people logging into this live chat the day after the election on that Wednesday to ask her, how do I not slap the person next to me for gloating because they won and we lost? Or how do I keep from dancing around the living room while my spouse is ready to strangle me because my candidate won and he lost? It was a really interesting conversation, once you got past the advice to, look for the great good in other people and everything, which is hard to do the day after the election. I mean, who are kidding? But, people are one of the things that, and I don't know, this may or may not be what you were talking about, but one of the immediate effects of this particular election has been people are trying to figure out a way to repair their relationships, and maybe with each other across the aisle, but also, in some people are super engaged and some people are really scared and they don't know how to communicate that to each other or handle it, in those relationships. And I think that goes beyond a household. It's going to be in the parties too. If it's happening between a husband and a wife, it's happening between, 2 state reps. I don't see that there's any difference in that. So, for what that's worth,
Yeah, no, it seems to me, it's odd to me we have the conversation and race doesn't come up explicitly, and I still think that that's plain.
Well, that's part of it.
It's not the only thing.
But the Democrats, even if Hillary Clinton had been the nominee, the Democrats were really, really mad about the last 8 years.
Yeah.
And, Republicans who had supported Bush were to some extent becoming really, really defensive about that. And so you were going to have some of these dynamics anyway. It was pretty tense. It's like, and then you overlay this, the racial stuff and the, it was a really emotional election kind of on both sides. And, it was a peculiar election in one sense that we had, it was a pretty substantive election actually, where you sort of actually knew some of McCain's positions and you actually knew some of Barack Obama's positions, and not just the stuff they were slinging at each other. It was a fairly substantive election. So it was, I think all of that's part of the mix. I don't think it was any one thing.
Yeah, on that, the round of polling we did right before the election, stuff that we're still processing, showed that, people's assessments of where they were on the issues was actually reasonably accurate.
Yeah. I beat this statistic to death every time Ross and I appear and give a speech together, do a dog and pony show together. It seems to me the most important statistic for this election and going forward is that 40% of all kids born in this country since 1981 are the children of African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, or mixed marriages. And obviously race is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, and if things go badly, it could become ugly. But the truth is that when I first started doing this, if you profiled a Texas voter, they were they were empty nesters, above median income, and overwhelmingly white. Well, with each election, that's less and less significant in terms of what the voting demographic is and what the demographic of the state is, and so that inevitably has to become the question of our first black president has to be a receding question, except maybe behind the pine curtain in Deep East Texas.
Okay, let's talk about the speaker's race. What's going on?
Was that?
What's the latest?
Nobody has the votes. Really the bottom line is nobody has the votes yet. Tom Craddock is trying to defend his seat, win a 4th term as Speaker of the House. He doesn't have the votes yet. It's a peculiar situation for a sitting speaker to be in, but now that Linda Harper Brown apparently has won, and we know that it's a marginally Republican House, and Craddock's the Republican Speaker, he still doesn't have the votes. So, it's not just the Democrats doing this. So you've got 5 or 6 serious Republicans who are competing for this thing, and we're kind of in the same question we were in 2 years ago when this happened. And it's, a friend of mine calls this legislative osteoporosis, the question of whether they can actually grow their backbones back, or whether the bone loss is so great that they won't really challenge Craddock. And so, let there be light. And so, we have the situation where they've got a pack of Democrats who've signed off, we're told, we haven't actually seen it, we're told they've signed off on this pledge not to vote for Craddock under any circumstances.
They don't like pledge cards, but apparently this is okay
Right.
if it's all on one piece of paper or something. I don't know.
Don't sign anything, but sign this.
A petition is
Sign this saying you're not going to sign anything else.
That's right. Promise not to sign.
So who's the holder of that document? Does anybody know?
I think that's Jim Dunham document. He's the head of the House Democratic Caucus. And so they've got, 61 or 2 or 3 names on that. They hand it to the Republican candidates. This is how this is supposed to go. They hand it to the Republican. What happened was they went into the Democratic caucus. They said, would you guys support candidate X? And they had a pillow fight. So they said, okay. And they backed up and they said, would you sign this document saying at least you won't vote for Craddock? And they sort of agreed on that. So they got most but not all of the Democrats to sign that. They handed it to the Republican candidates and said, bring your friends. When we get to 76, we've killed the king. And that was days ago.
Yeah, that was, yeah, exactly. That's
that
like
was middle of last week.
Yeah, Thursday or Friday. And last I heard they were missing 14, which is about what they were missing last session, give or take, 1 or 2, which makes all the difference now, particularly. But I mean, at this point, unless something crazy happens in Linda Harper Brown, which you and I were talking on the way here, it's, recounts almost never flip it, just period, unless they find just some massive, voting error or something. But it's a pipe dream to think that a Democrat's going to be a Speaker of a Republican House, even if it's just a 2-vote lead. So, I mean, pretty much all those guys on that list of Democrats kind of went out the window on that, I think that the Republicans and all their, the House Republicans and all their disarray are going to know better than to split enough to elect a Democratic Speaker. I don't think there's really any scenario in which case a Democrat's going to lead this House this session. Now that we know that it's going to be a Republican, I don't know if anybody's going to really say that on the record for a couple more days, actually, but, I think the Democrats may still be trying to work out their strategy. But we'll just assume it's going to go ahead and be a Republican. And now that we know that it's going to be a Republican, the question of whether it's going to be Craddock or not is not something that a lot of people are going to be betting on at this point either. Everybody was ready to bet against Craddock last time, and he won. Fairly
But it's
decently.
worth noting that he didn't win. They had to chub the vote for 3 hours. Chubbing the vote means having people on the back mic asking irrelevant questions for 2 or 3 hours.
It's a matter of talking loudly so that nobody hears the arms cracking behind you.
That's right.
But he won.
Meanwhile,
he won.
While the arm twisting was going on in the back room, the Speaker was sitting with his children, his grandchildren in front of the press table.
Right next to the press, yeah.
Right.
With the sounds of the Godfather theme wafting through the back.
Do you renounce
You
the
said
devil?
it, I didn't say it.
It seems to me that the argument Republicans are having among themselves right now is that after redistricting, they had 88 Republicans. That's a 13-vote majority. They're down to a 1-vote majority right now going into a redistricting year, not this time, but the next time. And what is the trend that Craddock brings to the table that increases their numbers in the next election cycle? If we stay on this current trend line, it'll be a Democratic House during the 2011 redistricting. So is Craddock... In speakers' races, people rarely think strategically. They almost always think tactically. But somebody off camera has got to be thinking strategically. That is Craddock the guy that can hold this together, at least until we get to redistricting, so that Republicans will be in charge of the map. And what I kind of think is going to happen is the establishment Republicans in Houston and Dallas are going to give their guys a pass. We'll hold off the SRE, the State Republican Executive Committee types and the conservative coalition as best we can, and you guys come to some kind of choice that actually has a future for the Republicans going into House redistricting in 2011. Now, that's maybe a little too complicated, I don't know, but at the end of the day, it doesn't make any difference because Craddock did not have a governing majority in the last session, and he won't have a governing majority in this session. It is too fragile. His leadership style isn't working, and pockets of resistance on the floor can just pick off bills, and he has no method of real discipline.
So go ahead.
I don't think people in politics generally will pass up on the thing that's in front of them for a better thing later. I mean, they just generally don't do that. They take the thing now. It's like, sort of the Dixie theory. Dixie is my Labrador, and if there's a piece of if there's a hamburger on the counter and there's a brisket behind it, Dixie will not forego the hamburger for the brisket. She'll take the hamburger and then the brisket. They take the thing in front of them. So the thing in front of them right now is I think Craddock can win this race, and I think they look at it and say, we think Craddock can win this race. We're sticking with our guy, and we're going to put thumbscrews on any Republican who doesn't vote for him. And that's been their pattern up to now. That I don't see anything that breaks their pattern. It's only if and when Craddock himself says, I can't do it. I can't get there. If, say, this piece of paper the Democrats are passing around suddenly appears with 80 signatures on it, and he looks at it and says, well, that's right, I'm baked. If he drops out, then I think you can get to what Harvey's talking about. But as long as Craddock is in the room running for Speaker, I think, you know, they go down with that ship. And I actually think he's going to win this thing.
Is that 60-61? This is very inside baseball, I guess. But is that 60-61-62? Is that the sort of the ceiling for the Democrats, or can we estimate that there are a few others that are out there that are just too suffering from the bone disease to actually put their name on the list?
There's always a big portion of the House that will be, you know, when they get to 76 votes, when they really, truly get to 76 real votes, there will be 125 votes.
Yeah, that's
it's
right.
like that instant, and everybody will be saying, oh, you know, I was with you the whole time. You know, these 50 people will suddenly appear. Another thing that happens is if Craddock folds, we'll have more Speaker candidates, because the people who are bound to him are then free. And they might say, well, you know, I shave every morning, I look in the mirror, I see a Speaker.
Yeah. I agree generally with what Ross said, and you always default for the incumbent, especially with all the institutional advantages that Tom Craddock has. But he hasn't been able to punish in primaries nearly as effective as he had in the past. His numbers have diminished, and some of his core lieutenants, Dan Gaddis, is essentially from the inside out kind of carving out the core of that Republican coalition. And I have reason to think that Craddock has had conversation with a number of these folks and said, if I can't get there, then I'll stand down and I'll endorse you, and has been told by some of these folks that, no, I'm in, and I'm opposing you. And that is something that's different from the last time around. So,
boy, I will see that. I will believe that when I see it, though. Him standing down. Yeah, really.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't believe he'll stand down.
Yeah,
I think that was just an offer. But I do think that conversation took place, and Gaddis said, no, I'm in.
So we just, you know, I mean, we you know, it could free them a little bit now that they know what the result of the Harper Brown election is in Irving. So they sort of know what the makeup of the voting electorate is, right? This is like a high school election with money, because you know all the voters. There's 150 people in the class. You know, they all have some version of, this one did me a favor in the 3rd grade, that one stepped on my foot in 5th grade, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And they actually, you know, when you're doing a speaker's race, I mean, some of the people in the room have been involved in these things. They have like a wall of cards, and it's 150 cards, and yep, nope, and they know the reasons and the motivators for each one of those people. And if it sort of follows history, we'll be done with this before Thanksgiving. You know, the one real different election was 2 years ago when they went all the way to January. I guess they could do that again. You know, I kind of think they settle it quicker than that.
We haven't mentioned two personalities that are in, you know, looming large in the speaker's race. One is Terry Keel, the parliamentarian, who is a huge polarizing figure among both Republicans and Democrats. There's very little confidence in Terry's judgment, ability, balance as a parliamentarian. And in the rush after the election, everybody's looking for personal advantage. I think that conversation is going to evolve over the next week or two, and he's going to be a lightning rod. I also think Terrell Smith on the opposite side, the new chief of staff, is probably a good thing for the speaker. Mm-hmm. He's calm. He spent the last 4 or 5 months trying to calm the waters. He's less confrontational than his predecessor. There's more room for conciliation and more kind of a member reaching out for consensus. And so those are two things that we had, two personalities that we hadn't mentioned that'll have some kind of impact in all of this. But at the end of the day, it seems to me that people are eventually going to focus on Terry Keel, and if he's the guy that is the enforcer, ultimately that's not a good thing for the speaker.
That's true. That's true. I agree with that too. I've heard people saying that are normally would be Craddock supporters saying, I can't support you if Keel is in that seat. He just made too many people too mad last time, you know.
And we have this whole rules fight that's going to happen on the first day. Keel is diligently working, supposedly with the Rump Group, on the new set of House rules. But after the application of the rules last time, I don't think anybody trusts what's going to be in a document that comes from Terry, even if everybody scrubs it and reviews it. And that's just a huge amount of baggage to walk into. So normally we have some kind of procedural test vote, usually over a secret ballot. But we could well have a day-long 12-hour battle of rules as everybody's looking for what the hidden trap is, what the authority is granted to the speaker underneath there that nobody otherwise saw.
Keel's a sharp guy. When he was in the House, he was one of the smartest guys on the floor, and so it's not easy to outmaneuver him or outsmart him. And I think Harvey's dead on when he says that people don't really think they can trust it even if they scrub it, because, you know, he can outsmart people. I mean, he's, you know, he's a sharp guy.
And even the people that like him, you know, the problem for him is really that they see him as a creature of Craddock instead of a creature of the House. And they like to believe, you know, whether it's an illusion or not, but they like to believe the parliamentarian's working for the House and not for the Speaker.
Right.
And that you're getting sort of a, you know, that you have somebody sort of in an umpire role there who's actually, you know, giving you a fair hand and telling the Speaker no sometimes, instead of just being someone who enables the rules on behalf of the Speaker against the House. And that's where Keel's, you know, that's kind of the position he's cut out.
Is there any way to figure out then what the agenda is before the House? I mean, you know, other than the budget, you know, what the political system is going to be faced with once this all gets sorted out in January? They come in session in January.
If you're a lobbyist, this is a great time to kill legislation. I mean, because the House is so evenly divided, the Senate's kind of has its own level of dysfunction that, you know, really hadn't gotten enough press because the House has been so much fun to cover, and the governor has a competitor breathing on him. I mean, there's everybody's at risk this time, and I think that there's a million ways to die over there. So, you know, lobbyists who are here to kill a piece of legislation or to make sure something doesn't happen, or interest groups or advocacy groups or whatever, those guys, it's all good. If you're trying to get something brand new, with one exception I'll come back to. If you're trying to get something brand new, it's going to be a very difficult session to get stuff. The one exception is everybody, there were a bunch of close elections. You've got a bunch of people in the House who want something to take home that they can say, look, I got a pelt, I brought something home. So there's a lot of what I call TV bills. TV bills are when we're sitting in the House, we're all listening to the drone. It's like the trombone teacher in a Peanuts cartoon. It's, you know, wah, 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 wah. And you look up and all of a sudden there's 27 TV cameras. And these are what I call the TV bills. It's bills like, you know, the cheerleader booty bill, or the, you know, don't dial while you're driving bill, all of those kinds of things. And if you look at the first day of bill filings,
There's a lot of those.
there's a whole lot of TV bills in there, and there's a whole lot of, and that's the kind of stuff, it serves two purposes really. They get something they can take home. They like being in headlines. They're drawn to this like moths to that light. And they also, if you're talking about stuff like that, you're killing all this other stuff.
Yeah.
Every minute you spend talking about something like that is a minute you're not talking about a transportation bill you don't want to vote on, or an insurance bill you don't want to vote on, or all of these kinds of things. So I think it'll be a great session for that kind of stuff.
Which makes it fun for people like us.
Right.
If
When we're having fun, it's generally not good for the
It's not good for the Texas, that's right.
That's why we're still cursing that it's not a tie. It's not 75-75.
The press is happy. Things
Things are bad, yes.
Well, don't forget, we get to pick on the Texas Department of Insurance and Texas Department of Transportation. They're both up for sunset this time.
Right.
And there's a lot of resentment out there. Times are going to it's going to be economically hard times. People are going to start feeling the recession in Texas. And those kind of resentments take themselves out in sometimes bad policy. The margins tax didn't really rise to becoming an election issue yet this time, but business failures are going to start accelerating as a result of the margins tax. It's a transaction tax,
Right.
and you know, sales tax is flatlining and declining, and we don't have any money. All that surplus
Thank you,
is
Mr.
gone.
Greenspan.
Right. Oops, I think is the word you're looking for.
So the agenda, at the beginning of the day, we can't do anything serious because we don't have any money. At the end of the day, we're going to take it out on the Texas Department of Transportation and Texas Department of Insurance. So that's not totally a bad thing.
We could go on and on. I think I want to open it up for questions since, you know, what do we know?
Since the
Let's see
lights
what
are
they
back
want.
on for
Since the
now.
lights are back on. Okay, thank you guys very much. And the handsome young Sean is going to bring around a microphone to Dave Edwards here. My esteemed colleague, Dave Edwards.
Kind of like Oprah.
That's right. That's what happened to Phil Donahue.
I'd like to ask the panel to return to the question of the changes in the electorate and to focus specifically on any changes you see in attitudes on economic questions, both the fact that people are, general middle-class people are suffering more and more, and therefore perhaps more likely to vote their pocketbooks than they have been in the past, and the fact that the Houston small government people are, after all, participants in the biggest bailout in human history, probably beneficiaries of it, and I wonder whether all those sorts of different economic considerations might be producing fundamental changes in the electorate.
Well, obviously, when you watch the stock market drop 2,000 points in 10 days, it is sobering. And actually, it's not the middle class that I think has had their attention focused. I think it is the upper class that's had their attention focused. And I'm serious about that. One of the starkest things about this election was driving through Highland Park or River Oaks. In Highland Park, you would see Obama, Dan Branch, and Obama signs next to Dan Branch signs.
Which alarmed both candidates. It was a matter anti-matter.
Well, the only one out there that was
Right.
really playing off of it was Mark Strama. He wanted an Obama Strama ticket, but I think it cleared away all the debris. All the other storylines in the election disappeared. When you're starting to talk about runs on money markets and runs on banks, and as I told my class, they didn't get it until I said, you put your ATM card in and nothing comes out. That was the level of apocalypse that we were approaching in the weeks immediately before the election. And I don't know how durable it is. That's why I say if things are good by the next election, or at least stable, a lot of the resentment will dissipate. If we're still in decline, Katie, bar the door, because nothing good ever comes from financial collapse along with demagoguery. So.
Two things that showed up in the Democrats' polling and in their campaigns this time were straight out of the late 70s, early 80s. One of them was electric rates. And they didn't use it all over the place, but in some House races you saw candidates talking about electric rates, and we need to get a hold of this and re-regulate the utility companies and go back to that. I think that's an economic issue. I think that's how that translated. The other one was insurance, and it was insurance premiums are out of control. We need to elect the insurance commissioner. And we saw that in 5 or 6 races around the state, where, and that's again something straight out of the late 70s, the consumer movement in the late 70s and early 80s. To sort of pick up Harvey's point about the economy, when Reagan got elected in 80 and inherited, Carter's mess and, 15.5% mortgages and all of that kind of stuff, it actually took 3 years to get out of the hole, and Reagan's midterms were terrible for the Republicans. 82 was the last really truly great year for Texas Democrats, up and down the ballot. And a lot of that was because of the midterms. In 83, the economy really came gunning back, and 84 was morning in America. So, I mean, this could take a while. If it goes like that, it could take a while, and it actually could be sort of a rough couple of years for the Democrats, in spite of the fact that they just won the national offices.
Anything to add to that?
No.
Back there in the other corner? All right, Sean, you get to jog across.
Throw that microphone.
Just lob it.
Hi, I was just wondering what you think the implications of this election are for the gubernatorial race in 2010, and what do you think the odds are that we could end up with a Democratic governor in 2010?
Democratic governor in 2010, I'd still say it's a little bit too early to hope for something like that if you're a Democrat. I just don't see the statewide turning quite that way. If it coincided with the presidential election, maybe. I see more of a, I might be missing something here, but I see them having a closer shot, but I just don't see them pulling it out on the statewide level just yet. I mean, the Senate race is a pretty good judge of how the sentiment is, and the strength of the candidate does to some extent change those numbers, but at the end of the day, this is statewide, it's still a Republican. What it might do is affect the House makeup. In 2010, I think that there's going to be a lot of, redistricting discussion. I think you mentioned that earlier. That's going to affect the races in a lot of ways, and there are some statewide races that will be affected by this redistricting discussion. But I don't know that that's an issue that resonates with voters quite enough to tip it over the edge. I don't think the numbers are going to be close enough for that yet. But maybe maybe I'm missing something. I don't know.
Let's just start from the assumption that Democrats underperformed in Houston. I know it's surprising because Democrats Barack Obama won Harris County, but Ike was a Republican, and Hurricane Ike is a Republican, and disrupted their effort to get out the vote. Took a month out of the campaign between Labor Day and Election Day. So I don't know that we know yet what the depth. Right. It did rescue Ed Emmett. The Republican county judge, he got, millions of dollars of free TV. For those that had TVs, he got millions of dollars of free TV time. But we don't know the depth yet of organization that's possible in Houston because it was so disrupted. The border underperformed. That's historically been the case, but resources put in and level of engagement, I think that there's still, it's still a growth company. The Democratic Party in Texas is still an emerging growth company. The problem is that the Hutchison-Perry debate bleeds off the moderates. The theory is the bigger the primary between Hutchison and Perry, the more moderates will go to participate because that's going to be the most exciting race. Bill White has already sent signals that he's not going to, if Hutchison's in, he'll run for her open Senate seat, and he's the one that is the name that Democrats all seem to be crystallizing around. Right. And if he's out of the mix, then that's the fundamental problem that Democrats face. They don't have a single voice in Texas that can focus attention and deliver message.
Let me follow up on that a little bit, Harvey. Just because really another way of asking that question, it seems to me, was lurking earlier, which is, has the change in the national climate, the current array of, constellation of effects in the state, help statewide candidate recruitment for the Democrats?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that and the fact that the Democrats have shown that they can compete financially. There's three things in the sort of the mechanics of this election that I think are getting attention from both parties. The Republicans have built their Texas strength largely on a strategy of, if we win strongly in 7 suburban counties around the state, Collin, Denton, Montgomery, Williamson, those counties like that, the ring counties around the urban areas, they can get enough votes there to offset Democratic votes in the Valley and elsewhere in the state. And that's, when you sort of look at the maps of how they've built their victories, that's what they've done. So what happened in this election was that those margins were slimmed, and some of the races, some of the House races in those Republican counties are starting to crack. Maldonado and Williamson County, the Legler-Redmond race in suburban Harris County, the Republicans won it, but it was closer than it would have been. Fort Bend County was nearly a 50-50 split in statewide elections. That's one that has everybody sort of chattering. When you sort of look at those things, and then you look at the ability the Democrats showed more in March than in November to, if you have enough money and you have a good enough race, you can really jazz the vote. You can really jazz the turnout, and one of the things that I think got underreported a little bit in the race between Obama and Clinton in Texas is they both spent bucket loads of money on the ground. Yeah. They had these big ground campaigns, and it drove the vote. The Republican vote was up significantly in March. The Democratic vote was out of out of the park. Yeah. But those that accelerant wasn't present in November. Right. And so I think if you're a Republican or a Democrat and you're kind of looking at the mechanics of this thing, you look at the cracks in the suburban counties that the Republicans have shown, the ability of the Democrats and maybe the Republicans, if they did the same thing, to actually get votes out with new technologies, with a lot of money on the ground and those kinds of things. And then finally that first thing I said, the ability of the Democrats to compete financially. Yeah. I think they could probably get some serious candidates now. Whether they can win, I think I'd probably vote with Karen on that. I think they might be a cycle or two away, but they can compete.
I think when you look at the money, it's the whole notion of underperforming is a little misleading, right?
Right.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Karen.
No, go ahead, please.
There's one more dynamic that it seems to be in its infancy, and that's business was homogeneously Republican through most of the 90s. Mm-hmm. It is beginning to splinter and faction off, particularly in Houston. I'm drawing a blank on the name of Matison's group, First Thursday or something like that. That was a PAC. That's trial lawyers and business types sitting down together and performing as Democrats. Most folks don't remember that Ellen Cohen was recruited by the CEO of Texaco, former CEO of Texaco, to run Martha Wong because Martha was wrong on some business issues and on public education. Charles Butt in San Antonio has made a career out of following behind Leininger and trying to neutralize his money. And business is, while it's still overwhelmingly Republican, is beginning to bifurcate into two parties, and that's promising potentially for Democrats down
here. Hear it now.
There's also just a dynamic that shouldn't be discounted, which is, you touched on too, which is the strength of the candidates themselves. Right. The ability to recruit viable candidates as opposed to just placeholders on the ticket. It was very clear the cycle that the Democrats were serious contenders for some of these seats. You know, Diana Maldonado is a good example up in Round Rock. People went into this election much earlier in the year when Mike Crucy, the man who used to hold that spot, saw the writing on the wall and knew that the numbers combined with his own unpopularity in the district, and this is nothing that he hasn't said, you know, I mean, it's not any surprise to him, meant that, you know, Diana Maldonado's biggest chance of winning was being able to run against Mike Crucy. And so the first speculation that happened when Mike Crucy said he wasn't going to run again was that, oh, Diana Maldonado's not going to win this race now. Well, she turned out to be a very strong candidate. You know, define that however you like, but usually it means, you know, runs well, looks good, speaks well, smart, good background qualifications, you know. Suits the district, yeah. Politically matches, you know, the district. And so there was an ability to recruit those candidates this time around that we haven't seen in the party in a long time. Whether they can get that kind of momentum going on the statewide level, I don't know if it's going to be enough to pull it out. Yeah, but it certainly is not a dynamic to be ignored this time around. You know, there was I mean, better candidates. You're right.
Right. Well, there's still a Paul Hobby possibility. Kirk Watson obviously has ambitions. Rafael Anchia. I mean, there's some names out there, but you know, I think they're going to see which way the political winds blow for a little while before they really.
Seems to me like there's a lot fewer names than there are offices. Yeah.
I'd like to hear you discuss the ideological diversity among Texas Democratic office holders. As obviously you know, our Democratic congressmen are largely liberal, but when we get down to the lower levels, we get down to all the way to the level of constable, you know, all the way up to state legislative level. The question is basically, you know, how liberal, moderate, conservative is the Democratic Party at those levels? You know, is the old conservative Democrat dead, partly dead? What does it mean to be the Democratic candidate for sheriff? Ideologically, does it mean anything at all? Sort of where is the center of gravity in the Texas Democratic Party when we get to the state legislative level and below? I'd like to hear your views on that.
I think they tend to still be conservative Democrats. You know, there's some exceptions, and they tend to be urban. But I think you know at the sheriff level, at the county commissioner level, there's not a lot of radical Democrats there, and you still run into that thing when you go to a national Democratic convention that all the other Democrats from all over the country look at the Texas Democrats and go, "Those are Democrats."
Yeah.
I mean, we have some liberals, but you know what I'm saying. In the Texas House, we run the whole range. I mean, there are some people in there that would be liberals in any state, but there are a lot of moderate Democrats, particularly in these areas. You know, the Texas redistricting maps, the districting maps for the Texas House and the Texas Senate, to the extent that there are Democrats in areas that could be held by Republicans, those are conservative Democrats. That's how you win those seats. There's 2 or 3 or 4 Democrats who are in districts that they're just, I mean, on paper, there's no way a Democrat can win that district. You know, David Farabee, Joe Heflin, people like that. They're conservative Democrats. You can't be any other kind of Democrat. But a lot of this has to do with something Karen was talking about, that if a candidate is suited to a district and seems like to the people in that district like one of us, then you can overcome a lot of that stuff. You know, they'll say, they don't really, you know, if they have something else to label you with, as opposed to, I don't know that guy, but he's a Democrat, or I don't know that guy, but he's a Republican, and instead say, well, you know, I know the candidate, and Joe Heflin's a good guy, we like him, so they vote for him in the Panhandle, while they're just murdering Obama. And you know, I think McCain got 75% of the vote in his district. So, and Joe Heflin won as a Democrat.
Well, and that's what you saw that dynamic happen in Robbie Cook's old district, this rural district out in the, you know, kind of around Brenham area, where Robbie Cook was a conservative Democrat, and had been there for a long time. And when he decided not to run again, it was the assumption, and it was the correct assumption, that the Republican was going to replace him. that was a given. Chuck Hobson is another one. They're the self-styled WD-40s. They call themselves the White Democrats over 40, and their numbers are shrinking every time.
Right.
As soon as one of them steps down, a Republican takes his place 9 times out of 10. Now that didn't happen in Joe Heflin's district because Laney was campaigning for him.
Right.
I think that was kind of a fluke there, but you know, Chuck Hobson is another one of these rural conservative Democrats. By conservative, that doesn't mean they're voting with Craddock necessarily, but that just means that sometimes they can be counted on to support tort reform, or they can support, you know, the conservative business, you know, school finance and that kind of thing. So Chuck's got hanging on to his seat by about 100 votes. He's a Democrat. He's in,
Jacksonville.
Yeah. And
It's a 60% Republican district by
yeah,
most measures.
I mean, he shouldn't be there either, you know. So I'd have to say, yeah, that's
being the conservative end of the spectrum.
Absolutely, you know. And then you haven't even taken into consideration the Catholic Democrats and the Hispanic Democrats who tend to vote conservative on the social side of things. So you can't count on them for pro-choice votes or for, you know, necessarily gay marriage, you know, amendments. They tend to vote with the religious conservatives. That's true too. They tend to vote with the religious conservatives on some of those more social issues. So, you know, they kind of straddle both sides of that too.
In the Republican world, most of their candidates are picked in their primaries, so there's generally a premium on being ultra-conservative. It's very difficult, especially at the beginning of a redistricting cycle, for a Republican to get beat by a Democrat in a Republican-drawn district. The wild card among Democrats, I think, is the Latino population, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but it is culturally conservative. It is it's very entrepreneurial, very pro-business at a smaller level. It is not an organized community, except much like rural Texas, organized around its church. And with each election, there's more and more Hispanic participation, and they become more sophisticated as voters. But at the moment, it is very difficult to even envision a Democratic majority that gets too far onto a liberal reservation, given the Hispanic cultural patterns that are, at least for the moment, still dominant in Texas.
What's interesting is that the leader of the Democratic caucus is from Waco, of all places. Jim Dunham is D-Waco, which is, yeah. Whatever that tells you about the House Democrats, you know, that kind of is a microcosm.
Waco's kind of had a yellow dog history in the past. Yeah. So Chet Edwards is their
It's a Chet Edwards
congressman.
district.
Right, Nancy
yeah,
Pelosi's favorite vice presidential candidate is from Waco. So.
Yeah, yeah.
There you go.
You sure you don't want to put an adjective in there for Waco? One more chance.
No.
Okay.
Who can, you know? I mean, how can you describe Waco?
Question over here, and then we'll do one more after this.
That was an interesting question.
Thank you, Jim.
I just want to follow up what you were saying, suggesting about the Hispanic vote in Texas. That so you're thinking that they're more conservative than nationally, because nationally they went 2 to 1 for Obama, 3 to 1 in the under 30 age group for Obama, and you know the thinking was that when Hillary Clinton came down and she started off her campaign and along the border there, and thinking that the Hispanics would not go for Obama, all the stuff about not voting for a black man, and so on. So I don't know. Could you talk about some of the differences in the outcomes of Hispanic voters in Texas versus nationally?
Well, don't forget, if I might just jump in, in the age of George Bush and even the first election for Rick Perry, Republicans were getting 40% of the Hispanic vote. They tend to vote as they move up economically, socioeconomically. They vote like every other immigrant group: Italians, Irish, Jews, and Republicans, when they respectfully asked for the vote, were being reasonably successful getting Hispanic vote. The immigration issue got hijacked by talk radio. It became inflammatory and provocative. In 2006, there was we didn't do exit polling in Texas, but in the midterms, there was a 25% drop in Republican Hispanic vote nationally. And down in South Texas right now, we've got a wall. And these are culturally conservative people, but the wall is in their face, and it is an insult, as far as I can tell. And people who were polling 4 years ago as saying they opposed illegal immigration. We're here, we fought our way here, we're good citizens, and these latecomers are ruining it for all of us, are now solidly voting Democratic because of immigration issues, inflammatorily immigration issues. But up until this 2006 and 2008, believe it or not, along the border, they were showing, in a lot of counties, they were showing 1% to 2% Republican growth per election cycle. Right. That's been halted for right now, but it is at best a temporary halt.
I think it's also worth noting that on individual issues is where I tend to see that split. You know, we were talking about, in particular, House Democrats, okay, just in that. And so if you're, you know, overall they call them, you know, overall they identify as Democrats. They are, in fact, Democrats if you look at their record. Yeah. But on social issues in particular, you're going to see them vote with the conservatives. The other thing I've noticed, and you know, and that's obviously a generalization because some of them don't. Some of them are, you know, are hardline Democrats, and they'll vote with the Democrats every time on those. But the other thing to note also is that there's a large minority population that is involved in the war, and their kids are over there. Lots of their kids are over there, and their extended families are over there, and it resonates with them. I don't know if it. I don't know how much polling has been done on that. The stuff that I have seen, it reflects that, but it's also just, anecdotally speaking, they are very much tied to the war, and they care about that a lot. You know, from what I've heard and from what I've read and from the polling that I've seen. So the fact that they broke to Obama is not a surprise on a number of levels. But on social issues like the ones we were discussing, I think you can put them in that conservative, you know, in the House you can certainly do that. Right. I don't see that there's necessarily a conflict there.
Yeah, I think to some extent, you know, they were drifters. They were political drifters. They were open for argument. And as Harvey said, the Republicans were making some inroads. You know, Bush made a big thing out of doing really well in El Paso County, where I grew up, and along the border, and the immigration thing completely undermined that. So I think they remain conservative. It's kind of, go back to your question, I think they remain conservative, but right now, the more welcoming party to Hispanics is Democrats.
You have to look at the overall issue set, I think.
Right.
Really.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was not an election that was really fought on social issues this time around. You know, abortion, you know, gay marriage. There really wasn't. There was a couple of those referendums going on in the different states, but overall, that wasn't much a part of the discussion that I could tell. I mean, there was the fringe groups that were saying, you know, Obama's a baby killer or something, yeah. But you know, overall, that wasn't or socialist, whatever. But that wasn't a resonant argument.
Sarah Palin was the code word for cultural issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I think this was wallets and war this time. It was, you know,
yep.
and it wasn't the social issues.
And mainly wallets.
Yeah.
Yeah. Where's the mic? Well, we were right here and then back in the corner, and you'll be last. I said we'll go 2 more.
I'd like to ask the panel, if I'm not mistaken, I honestly don't remember if I was reading this about Texas or Colorado, but the Libertarian Party had a bigger turnout this election. Is that
William B. Strange is the first Texas Libertarian to get more than 1 million votes. He got 1 million votes in a Texas Court of Criminal Appeals race.
Okay.
This time around, against Kathy Cochran. So.
Okay, so my question is, you said there's also kind of been a growth in small government conservatives, and do you anticipate perhaps the Libertarian Party not emerging as a viable party or player, but maybe becoming a big enough of a player to take votes away from Republicans in the future, or?
Yeah, there were 4 races this time. I can jump in. There were 4 races this time. I'm not going to remember them off the top of my head. Linda Harper Brown was one of them. Deanna Maldonado was one of them. And I'll just say there were 2 more. You can go look. Chuck Hobson's one of them, maybe, where the Libertarian candidate got 2 or 3% of the vote and kept the 2 major party candidates below 50% of the vote. More importantly, in those races, the Libertarian got enough votes that if they had gone one way or the other, would have swung the race.
Bigger than the margin.
Yeah, the number of votes the Libertarian got was bigger than the margin. So, you know, in the Hobson race, in the Linda Harper Brown race, the margin, as we sit here, is 20 votes. The Libertarian got 1,024 or something like that. So.
You know, and the Libertarians like to say, you know, we take votes away from both parties, but when it comes down to it,
it's about 2 to 1 against the Republicans.
Republicans, that's right.
Yeah, the Greens take votes away from Republicans.
Yeah,
too.
3 of them maybe.
Yeah, they're spoilers, not kingmakers.
Right, but you know, because of Mr. William B. Strange, we will have Libertarians on the ballot next time. As long as they get 2% in the statewide race or 5% in the legislative race, they're on the ballot automatically next time. So they're around.
Thank you.
How do y'all see the Craddick D's affecting the speaker's race this go around?
Go for it.
I mean, it's kind of a stable group. There was erosion at the end of last session when people like Patrick Rose and Eddie Lucio III publicly said they were off the reservation, but Craddick and his forces won enough Democratic primaries to pretty much have us back to broke on that. The issue isn't going to be I don't think there's going to be that particular any dramatic growth in Democratic D's. The issue is an internal conversation in the Republican caucus right now as to whether he's going to be the speaker. And inertia works to his advantage, but you know, the flip side is they kind of like the people who've been there for a while, but like the place to work.
You know, and they did pick up a Craddick D while they lost one or two in the primaries. They picked up a Craddick D in South Texas.
Craddick winning 4 seats in the primaries.
Yeah,
Four votes.
They picked up a Craddick D in South Texas, and I guess a few more.
Al Edwards and a couple of other
Al
places.
Edwards, that's
Moreno
right.
was defeated by somebody presumed to be a Craddick D, I think Quintanilla.
Yeah, and so there's I think the ones that softened up at the end of last session, a couple of them may stay, but there are a few more that didn't. One of the reasons they softened up is because they put their necks out for Craddick and then they didn't get what they needed to get out of him. That's why he lost a couple of Republicans too. Norma Chavez is one of the Craddick D's who really put everything on the line with her party and then lost her casino vote by 1 vote, her Indian gaming vote by 1 vote. Tie vote, that's right.
The speaker did not break the tie.
And the speaker didn't break the tie. So that's, the 1 vote. It's the 1 vote that she needed that she didn't get. And I've never seen anybody so angry on that House floor. And she right then she withdrew her commitment, which doesn't mean she withdrew her support. She just said, I don't know anymore. I just don't know anymore. I haven't talked to her lately. I don't know if you have, but there was a number of those that may or may not be coming back into the fold. Now, another Craddick D, Donna Dukes from Austin, said publicly in the paper over the weekend that the Democrats caucus, the 60-some odd, weren't giving her any reason to come back, to the party. They were giving her reason to believe that if Craddick didn't win, she was going to be toast. She was going to lose her appropriations subcommittee, and if she's telling the truth, that's a terrible strategy on the part of the Democratic caucus.
Right.
Because they're not giving her any reason to go back, whether that's true or not.
That they wouldn't have a good strategy.
I know. What's interesting is that she's saying flat out, I'm going to need you to promise me a couple things before I can come back. Which technically, it happens 100 times a day, but technically, they're kind of not supposed to do that, And there's really no guarantee that either one's going to happen. Are they going to reward them from coming back and helping them, or are they going to punish them for leaving?
You get this weird problem when you put a speakership together. They don't ultimately care about party up front. They want the first 76 people through the door. I'll take the first 76 votes. I don't care where they come from.
Right.
But if you're in a House that's 76 to 74, and if there are, as there are now, there are about 40 committees in the House, you're going to have 20 Democratic chairs and 20 Republican chairs, or you're going to have some kind of a fight. And if you do that, let's say I'm a Republican and I've given 20 chairs to Democrats, and I have 20 or 30 Republicans who think they ought to be chairing committees, but these Democrats have these committees. That's the nucleus of my next opposition. And where the Craddick D's came from, they were the people who, for whatever reason, weren't at the front of the line in the House when the Democrats had it. And so Craddick was able, when he was putting his speakership together, to go to those guys and exploit the grievance and to go to them and say, listen, you're hosed right now. You'll probably do better if I'm the speaker. And they were like, well, I'm hosed right now. There was no loss to them. So they didn't have a risk. And now, you've got these two groups. You've got the ABC Republicans, and you've got the Craddick D's, and then you've got this big block of Republicans over here and a big block of Democrats over here. Now, I'll say about the caucuses, the Democrats caucused immediately after the election. Came up with this thing we were talking about where they signed this piece of paper. I called the chairman of the Republican caucus and said, okay, so when's your meeting? What are you guys doing? He said, we're not going to meet until the 19th. And I said, what's up with that? And, you know, sort of bounced it around with some other people. They didn't want to meet because they weren't going to come out with 60 anythings for anything. and they just decided it was better not to put them all in a room until, you know, let this settle down for a week and a half or 2 weeks, and then don't meet in Austin, let's meet in Bastrop. So they're going to meet up at the Lost Pines.
Where there's a golf course.
Yeah, Lost Pines, Lost Republicans and Lost Pines. So
Hosted by the Kleinschmidts?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I think there was an implication there's something wrong with you know, Democrats crossing over to join a Republican speaker. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Pete Laney had a broad consensus when he was the speaker. He had Republican support. Right. There's just been so much blood in the water and so much confrontation with Craddick as the speaker that he's become more of a lightning rod than his predecessor and presumably his successor will be. When you only meet for 5 months every 2 years, you know, Democrat versus Republican counts on a few issues like a voter ID bill, but the bigger deal in Texas is who's got water and who wants your water, or who's got road money and who isn't going to get road money.
And yet Karen says that the Republicans won't cross the other way. You're presuming that
if it's a 76-74.
Some Democrats will cross over to vote for the Republicans, but
I think if you're a Republican, if you're the Republican who causes a Democrat to be elected to preside over a Republican House, you just lost your election.
Right.
You just lost your primary.
75-75 though, I don't think that was
that
was going to be the.
I agree with you on that. Plus, there's always people that are.
That's probably true if the Democrats were in control too. If you were
that's
the
right.
you know,
That's
if you voted
right.
against your party, they're going to have some good TV ads.
Yeah.
Only Willie Brown could pull that off in California.
Right. And only for one term.
Right.
Right.
And the guy who flipped to vote for him got beat. Yeah. So.
We don't take prisoners, we just take them out and shoot them.
The one last thing I want to add real quick is that the newest rumor going around, or maybe the newest one that I just heard it, it might have been going around for a week, was that, well, the most interesting that I think and the funniest is that there are now talk of people switching parties in order to change the numbers passed, you know. I asked one of the names kept coming up. I heard you're going to switch, you know, so-and-so switching parties, you know. And I asked him, are you going to switch parties? And he's like, hell no, you know. So I'm like, you know what? I don't think that there's going to be any of that happening. You know, there might be, but there's been that's the newest and most fun rumor, is that they're jumping ships.
A few weeks ago, but the deal is that if you switch parties, you've got, I mean, Greg Laughlin was the great party switcher who then, he switched from Democrat to Republican. But didn't go around and meet all the precinct chairs in his district and didn't do all the due diligence and prepare it. And they said he's a carpetbagger and an opportunist. This was, of course, when the Republicans took over Congress. So kind of the standard that's been set since then is it's okay to switch parties. You're going to get challenged, generally speaking, but you need to go do your homework after the session and prepare whoever the opinion shapers are in your district to get ready for it. Right. But don't walk into a session, switch parties, and then vote for speaker because you're a marked person from that point on. Much as Linda Harper Brown is the #1 target for the...
She's now the #1 target for the Democrats in 10.
For 2010.
Let's leave with final thoughts. Real quick.
You know, I think 2010 is going to be a really interesting election if everybody, you know, if the right people jump out of office. Then it's a musical chairs election, you know, where all the seats are open. You know, if Dewhurst, for example, runs for something else and frees the light governor, then the Attorney General runs for his job, and somebody runs for the Attorney General's job, and we jangle the whole thing. And we haven't really done that since 1990, and, you know, really shaken the whole place up. So, you know, I mean, I don't know that it'll happen, but, you know, that's on my Christmas list.
More chaos. More chaos for us.
Well, I just think it'd be a really interesting election to sort of see, you know, I mean, it would answer, to some extent, the question here is, who are the Democrats who are going to step up, if any? Yeah. And then the second question is, you know, we've got these Republicans running. Do they have a bench? Is there another group of Republicans behind this group who's going to come in and fill those offices? And, you know, there's sort of the pent-up demand behind, you know, would Perry and Hutchison please get out of my way so I can run for office? Yeah. And there's some people in that position. So that's my wish list.
I'm looking for this session to be very colorful in terms of which I think your TV bill theory is dead on, which means it's not going to be one of those long long, boring budget or finance, nothing important like that. It's going to be very interesting and colorful in terms of the policies they're going to be discussing. As far as it being as crazy and surreal and divisive as it was toward the end of last session when there were all these attempts to unseat the speaker, well, it's always weird and surreal, always, no matter what. But I think that once they get past that first couple of weeks, that first day, no matter who ends up winning, I can't predict what these guys are going to do entirely. They surprise me all the time. But I don't see there being a session-long effort to disrupt the speaker, as long as he stays, gets the message that it's going to happen again if he stays in power. I think if Craddock stays at the top, which there's a decent chance of that, then I think there might be some business at hand going on for a while. I think we could see a let up of the politics. Everybody got hurt in some way during that last time. Democrats lost some, Republicans lost some. Right. I think they do have much more now than ever before, particularly with the very close numbers. They have motivation to get back to their voters and say, we actually did something this time. At the end of the day, the voters don't really know who Craddock is. There's a little more name recognition than most, but 11%, nobody knows who he is. And nobody cares. All they know is that the biggest measures of the session passed on the last day, and they were junk. They were not what anybody wanted, and they were not what anybody had asked for. So this time, and they got punished for it. A lot of people got punished for it. So I think there's a good chance that there's going to be less rancor. There may not be as much going through, because you're right about killing bills. But politically, there's a shot there. It might, but who knows? That's my last thought. Is I don't know. How's that?
It was honest. I like it.
I like it closing. That's ask for the sale. The one chamber we haven't talked about is the Senate, and that is, for all of this decade, or most of this decade, we've had 11 Democrats, and it was pretty easy to peel one or two of them off. Right. To stop a bill, to keep the 11 from coalescing to stop legislation. Now there's going to be 12 Democrats and potentially 13 Democrats. One of the great pleasures of the 1990s was watching Bob Bullock go from a Democratic majority to a Republican majority, and how he changed his method of governance. It was still abusive, but how he accommodated the Republicans, the growing Republican numbers. Governor Dewhurst, and some of you may or may not know, was removed from the chair for a couple of weeks during the end of the last session for bad behavior, and
that's right.
And there are now more Democrats, with the potential of 13 Democrats, and that means some of the voter ID is dead. Leticia Van de Putte, the Democratic caucus chair, said that she had to put those anklets, the monitoring anklets, on all of her Democrats, so she knew where the 11 were at any given moment. Yeah. That obviously eases up. It makes lobbying a whole lot less expensive, because it's not going to be. You don't have to worry about that 11th peeling off quite as easily as you did previously. And the question is, not only does that modulate the Senate, but does it modulate the House? If it's clear that some crazy stuff has no future in the Senate, speakers typically don't let votes come to the floor that are going to cut up members that have no future in the Senate. And so does that tone the rancor down, because there's no point in having some of these culturally divisive House votes in the House floor? It could be, God, I hate to say it, but a relatively calm session, because there's more Democrats in the Senate.
Ross Ramsey, Karen Brooks, Harvey Kronberg, just as much fun as I would hope. Thanks very much.